aspects of the mind, I suppose, as they appear in the manifest image, don't quite appear in the scientific image, in the image of, say, of neuroscience. Now, the trick is to try and bring these images into some sort of harmony. I think we can understand minds a lot better than some people think. And I think if we do that, that's going to put us in a better position to understand the lives of our fellow creatures and indeed the lives of each other. I really think that we treat animals atrociously. And I think I should be doing more. I do feel wrong about that. I don't think I'm making the right trade-off. I'm quite happy and pleased to see people like you pushing on that, because I think it's right and good.
Hey Keith, how are you?
Hi Jamie, I'm good. Thanks for inviting me onto the podcast.
It's wonderful to have you here, and I feel like I have a slightly strange parasocial relationship with you already because I've watched and listened to so much of Mind Chat. So if I'm inappropriately familiar through the conversation, you will know why. But I've been really keen to get you on for a long while because the themes of your work play in so beautifully to the deep questions we like to ask here, and I guess the concept of the mind is central to that because you've done work both on belief and reasoning capacities of the mind, but you've also done an enormous amount of work on what actually is the mind, what are consciousness, what is sentience. And given my bias in this conversation, that's a central question. What is sentience and who has it? But to frame the conversation, I guess it's a series of conversations about what I think of as those deepest philosophical questions. And I think they're often neglected, frustratingly, in public discourse. So I'd like to call them, the what's real question about how do we understand reality and how do we work out what to believe? And just as importantly, the deep questions of ethics, what matters, but critically, who matters, that question of moral scope. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to develop and popularize this really simple, pluralistic worldview of sentientism, which I describe as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So on the epistemological side, it says use a broadly naturalistic approach, big dose of humility, evidence and reason, good faith attempt to understand reality, change your mind as the evidence changes, that sort of classic start. And then is open-minded about ontology and what you believe, but it just says this is a good toolkit to use epistemologically. And on the ethical side, it's very pluralistic and open-minded. It's also completely neutral on philosophy of mind in a way as well. But it does say that whether you're a virtue theorist or a care theorist or a deontologist or, whatever you like, you must grant serious moral consideration and have compassion for every sentient being, every being that has the capacity to have experiences, to feel, to experience things, regardless of what sentience is, even if maybe it's an illusion, say. So I should stop rambling on with the intro, but that's the framing of the general conversation. And it would be great to explore how you've answered those questions through your life, how you think about them now, what the implications are for how you might make a better future. But before we get onto those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself?
Oh, right. Yes, hi. By the way, I don't think sentience is an illusion. We'll come to that, back to that.
Yeah.
So that's probably what I'm best known as a person who thinks consciousness is an illusion, and I don't think that. I think something's an illusion, but we'll get into what exactly it is. So, well, first, thanks for having me on. As you say, we've interacted quite a lot actually on social media, formally on Twitter, now on Blue Sky, and so I do feel that I'm quite familiar with you. So it's nice to be here and actually.
It's not just one way, then. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm familiar with your work and your campaigning, which I'm very much in sympathy with. I mean, that will again come out, I think. So who am I? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? You get to a certain stage in life where these questions become almost questions of creative narrative. You look back and you start, when you ask this question, my stage in life, you realize there are lots of stories you can tell about yourself, selecting from all of the events that have happened, and you can tell a story of yourself as successful or very unsuccessful, or happy or very unhappy. I find it depends how you select and how you link things together. And of course, memory is very, very fallible. So my childhood as I remember it and my childhood as it actually occurred, or as other people perceived it. Who knows? Well, what can I tell you? Well, my name's Keith Frankish. I live in Greece, in Crete. I have an honorary professorship at my old University of Sheffield in the UK and various other affiliations. Do some teaching, bit of teaching here at the University of Crete. But I spend most of my time thinking about the nature of the human mind, the nature of consciousness, and getting involved in these sometimes rather lively debates. So I write about that, both academic work and more popular work. And I suppose I have a sort of campaigning streak in me too. As I see it, the state of consciousness science is unsettled. We don't really have a paradigm for thinking about consciousness, and we're in this state of sort of revolutionary state. Although it's not that we're revolting from previous paradigm, we never had a paradigm for thinking about consciousness, and we're trying to fight to establish one. And I think this is an important issue. It's important for science. It's important for philosophy, obviously, but it's more important for science, I think, because it shapes how science is done and where funding goes and what sort of programs people devote their energies to. Important for knowledge, for growth of human knowledge. And I think it may also have ethical implications too, which we'll get into. So I do see a lot of what I'm doing as trying to invite people to look at things maybe a different way from the way they're used to looking at them. And we'll get into what that way is, perhaps.
That's
later,
not always comfortable.
That's how I see myself.
But it's very clear that you're not a sort of ivory tower philosopher. You're out there on YouTube and podcasts and having engagements. And like you say, there's a sort of campaigning edge. There's things you're trying to make happen. You're not just abstractly putting your opinions out into the ether. Yeah.
Yes, again, there are different stories you can tell about this, but I as I said, living in Greece, we came here for a variety of reasons, but family reasons were an important ones. There's some caring responsibilities. My wife is, well, she's dual nationality, but she grew up here in Greece. And so we left our UK academic jobs to come here. And so I didn't completely leave academia in the day, but I remained, had affiliations and some connections with the universities here. But I moved more to the edges. I like to think, at the time it was a frightening and risky thing to do, but I think it freed me to spend more of the time doing the things that I really consider important. So in retrospect, at least, I think it looks, or at least I feel happy with it. And it has freed me to be more, to devote energies to things that perhaps wouldn't have got rewarded within rewarded within the formal academic structures.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
I like to think.
Yeah. Well, let's start digging into some of those areas. So the first of the deep questions we like to ask here is, I frame it as what's real, but it's really the question about epistemology and how do we understand this crazy universe we all share. And obviously epistemology covers, it's relevant to every domain, but an interesting way into it for some of my guests is whether they grew up in maybe a religious, supernaturally, faith-oriented context, or one that was already more sort of naturalistic or scientifically minded, or a mix of the two, and how that side of their thinking has changed over time, if it has. So I don't know if that's a quick story to tell, just to cue up roughly where you've got to now on those questions.
Not a very dramatic story to tell. I grew up in I guess a working class family. My parents were both smart people. They passed their 11 plus exams, went to grammar school, but they didn't have the family support needed to continue their education beyond that. And so my father worked as a skilled manual worker. My mother worked as a carer and a homemaker, housewife. And it was a very ordinary, dramatic environment. Religion was present, but in a very watered down, typically English sort of way. So I was baptized, and we would go to church occasionally, and even for a short period I went to Sunday school, but I didn't like it very much, so that stopped. Members of our family were, other members of our family were quite religious, but in a way that I didn't find, it was never oppressive. In fact, my uncle, who I deeply loved, was a seriously committed Christian, but also a wonderful man, wonderful example of the compassion and the commitment to social justice that can come with that comes with religion. So I didn't have a sort of positive, I didn't have a negative sense of religion, but it wasn't an important thing in my life. And I remember a little anecdote that I don't know what age I was, fairly young, but I was looking in an encyclopedia. I think I was looking up something to do with psychology, because I was always interested in the mind. And there was just this sentence in the encyclopedia about the soul, and it said, it was a bit of history about belief in the soul, and it said, today the majority of psychologists and scientists do not believe in a soul. And so I read that and I thought, oh right, there's no soul then. And that was it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
honestly, now you may think, oh, my goodness me, what an uncritical mind he had. But it just seemed to me, and what that does reveal, I think, is I don't know exactly how I got it, but I had a very strong inclination to trust science against any other, certainly against religious interpretations of the world. And I liked science so much at school. And I suppose there's another world in which I would have become a scientist. Things intervened, health issues intervened that prevented me from completing my schooling. So I spent a lot of time educating myself, really, reading and so on. And of course, you can't really educate yourself in science, but you can educate yourself in philosophy. In fact, I sometimes say that philosophy is the thing that it can only be taught by self-education in the end. So, and the humanities, I read a lot of literature and history and these sorts of things. So my path went somewhat away from science, but I always felt that they were the people who were actually uncovering the nature of reality. They were the people who were explaining things. And I was just fascinated by understanding things, how things worked. My dad was an engineer, really, and he was fantastic at explaining how things worked and taking things apart. He could take our car apart to the last nut and bolt and put it back together and tell you how it worked. And I love that. I love this idea of understanding how things worked.
Yeah. And there's a fascinating interlink between the sort of, evidence and facts and having a hypothesis that matches reality, but that sort of softer thing about actually being able to explain and having an explanatory framework. There's an interplay between the two. Yeah,
absolutely. It was the second, I think, that fascinated me about it. It wasn't that science was just cataloguing a lot of facts. It was showing us how things worked, revealing the secrets.
Yeah.
And I've always had a love of magic. I can't do it, but I've always loved it. And I've always loved trying to work out how magic tricks work. Of course, once you know how they work, it's kind of generally a bit disappointing, because the trick is that the mechanism never lives up to the effect. But that's kind of the wonder of it, how you can get such amazing effects from simple mechanisms, simple devices. And I saw that as that science was, to some extent, in that business. You see something like Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. It's kind of, you can explain it on a postcard, the basic idea.
Yeah.
But it explains so much.
Yeah.
It's got such wonderful explanatory power. And that kind of magic, that real magic, as Dan Dennett would say, the magic, the kind that you can actually, that isn't the kind of magic that isn't real magic, but is in another sense real, because it's actual, it's magic that can actually be done.
Yeah.
That involves tricks and so on. That always fascinated me.
And did the fascination with magic, was that one of the things that draw you to a fascination with the mind? Because clearly, that's really interesting interaction there. Yeah.
I think there were two. Again, I'm telling stories here. I'm selecting out now, making up narratives. I think there were two things. One was that I'd come away from science because of this illness, but I was still drawn back to the more science, the aspects of the humanities that were closest to the sciences. And so philosophy was a natural place to go, because I saw that a lot of modern philosophers were doing stuff that seemed very close to science, that was continuous with science, particularly in philosophy of mind. And at the same time, I'd always been fascinated. I've always been quite a self-reflective, introspective person, probably too much.
Yeah.
I've spent an awful lot of my life just sitting and thinking, often to no benefit whatsoever. I can be prone to anxiety a lot. And
yeah.
so I've spent a lot of time in my own head. And not only thinking about the world, but also thinking about the thinking that was happening in my head. And I remember, again, as a child, what are these thoughts that are occurring to me? How are they connected to each other? What exactly are they? Where are they? They're sort of inside me somehow, but they're not in my brain, really, are they? Where are they? And what causes them? And how are they connected to each other? And how are they my thoughts rather than just thoughts that exist? What makes them my thoughts? Is it because they're in me, or because I'm creating them? I remember being puzzled by this and sitting at quite a young age thinking about these things. And so this confluence of things, of wanting to get back into something closer to science and being fascinated by the mind, it all focused. And when I got I took my first degree with the Open University, which had a nice feature that you could do modularized a degree. And so I took courses in all sorts of, I was interested in classics, and so I took courses in ancient history. I actually taught myself Latin and ancient Greek, and so I was kind of interested. But increasingly, I saw that the stuff that was really getting me excited was the philosophy. And there's a really great philosophy course called on the rationalist and empiricist traditions in the late 80s that the OU taught, Reason and Experience. Fantastic course. And I saw that's where I wanted to go. But then when it came to the chance to do an MA, which I did at Sheffield, there was an opportunity there to get into modern philosophy of mind. They had a strong MA program in mind and intentionality. And there's Peter Carruthers was there, who's a really influential at that time, up and coming philosopher of mind, now of course very well established. And there's a chance to work with him, and so I thought, yeah, let's go for this. And that's
the path. Yeah. Thank you.
On ever since.
And some of your work, again, the centrality of the mind is a recurring theme here, I think. But some of your work is focused on that, belief and reasoning, and how do we do that epistemological process. And I think it was Mind and Supermind is your book that probably focused most on that. It's probably too much to ask you to sort of summarize, how do you think about epistemology now? But could you give it a go? Because in a way, without overloading it, but when I'm trying to explain what I think of as the sort of menu of epistemological choices, some people are so steeped in a sort of naturalistic way of understanding the world, they can't imagine there's any alternative. So they're like, well, what else would I use but evidence and reasoning? And I will say, well, there are alternatives, right? There's a fideism based on faith, which by definition doesn't require evidence. There's a dogmatism, which is very closely allied to it because it's impervious to changes in evidence. You just stick with what you've got. But there's also, unchallenged or unchallengeable deference to an authority, whether that's a text or a person or a state, or a revelation, right, which can be a religious experience or a revelatory experience. But there's some nuances there, because even if you have a sort of naturalistic approach using evidence and reason, you can do that well or badly, right? You can do that in genuine good faith with skill, with good quality evidence, or you can, use a sort of pseudo-scientific approach where you warp the evidence and the reasoning to fit what you already want to believe, right? But even on some of the other questions about, authority or revelation, it's not as clear as I might like to lay out, because as you said earlier on, in a way you were deferring to the authority of the psychologists, who most of whom said there wasn't a soul, right? So there's an appropriate deference to authority when they have a good epistemology, versus a completely unchallengeable deference to authority. And I should stop rambling on, but where I wanted to get to really was the revelation question, because, you might have a sort of obvious canonical example of someone who has a delusionary experience that leads them to believe things that are clearly untrue, right? That's a sort of obvious example. But in a way, all of our personal experience is a sort of revelation. And even the best evidence we get comes through this experiencing. So in some sense, isn't everything interpreted through a revelation? So I should stop rambling on, but I just wonder if there's a question in there or an opinion in there about how those things tie together.
Well, first of all, I'm not an epistemologist. My work is not.
Yeah.
Some of it might bear on it, but I'm not an epistemologist. I'm not an expert in that area, and so to some extent, what I'm saying here is merely amateur. I would take issue with your there. I think with that idea that everything is sort of revelatory because it's ultimately an interpretation of what is presented to us at a first person, what is presented to us subjectively. I think that's kind of what you're saying. I don't really see it that way. I don't like that starting point, that individualistic starting point.
I don't really either, but it's almost like a challenge to, some people would say that, well, everything comes through your experience. So,
well, yeah. I don't know. I think I'm here in the world. I think I'm here in the world with you and with many, many other people. And I think we're inquiring together. And if you start with that perspective, I like to say Descartes started with this question, what could he be sure of? He individually be sure of. What if he'd just taken as a starting point that there were lots of other people who were also inquiring? If he'd just taken that as a starting assumption and asked, what can we be sure of? Then you get a very different pattern of inquiry. So I'm not, I think there's an implicit, there's an implicit Cartesianism in this, that all we really know are our own mental states. I think our minds put us in touch with the world, put us in touch with it in a selective, distorted, interest relative way, but still in touch with the world. And when we get together with other people who are also in touch with the world in their own interest relative, selective, distorted way, and we start collaborating and comparing results and so on, well, essentially, and devising techniques for testing whose perspective is better and so on, then collectively, there is a collective subject of inquiry. There's what we might call a community of inquiry. I'm getting more and more pragmatist as I'm getting older. In fact, or maybe the pragmatism that was already there is coming out. So you get a community of inquiry, and then you can ask, what can the community of inquiry be sure of? And of course, you're not going to get foundational stuff, but this search for foundation seems to me. I don't like foundations. I don't like essences and foundations, and I think perhaps
there seems a strong human drive to try to find them, right? There's like a hunger to.
I find it, I'm almost. I think what drives a lot of my. I'm trying to speculate now about the psychology behind the approach that I take, and you're inviting me to do this. And I suspect that what drives, in relation to the epistemological questions you're asking about the approaches, deference to authority, revelation, and these sorts of things. I think I mentioned anxiety. I think my overriding desire is not to fool myself, not to be tricked, not to be taken in either by other people or by myself.
Yeah.
So if I had a revelation, sort of a revelatory experience, the one that seemed to be revelatory, I think, given the kind of person I am, I would be more inclined to think it was a delusion or a hallucination or something like that, than that it was a direct revelation of some deep truth. Just because of the kind of person I am, that I would, especially if it was a comforting revelation.
Yeah.
I would say, no, I don't want false comfort. I'd rather be miserable than have false comfort.
Yeah.
I'm that sort of person. You may think, what a sad person, but that's kind of the way. And so I'd rather know the truth and adapt and be prepared to deal with it than to live in a fool's paradise. Or maybe fool's paradise is a bit insulting, but to be deluded or to be self-deluded. And for that reason, I suppose that also goes along with the distrust of authority, in that, sure, I see inquiry as communal. I think other people are essential to it, that we inquire together. But that doesn't mean that any of us defer to each other as I mean, certainly other people know a lot more than me about things, and I defer to their knowledge, but only insofar as it's shown to be sound and reliable. And so on. I don't think we should. I'm certainly very suspicious of gurus.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think I hope nobody ever thinks of me as a guru. I wouldn't want them to, and I wouldn't want to be that. And I think it's don't like that.
No, I really like that approach, because on the one extreme is a sort of solipsistic approach that starts from the only thing I can be sure of is my own experience and maybe nothing else, and no one else exists. Okay, get stuck there if you like, but surely at least you can have a probabilistic view that others do exist and we are here together. The other extreme might be one that almost denies the salience of the subjective and says, look, there is a perfect, pure, crystalline reality that exists, and maybe that goes too far the other way. But it seems like your approach does find a balance between the two that I find resonates with almost our evolutionary story, right? I think it's highly likely we are, a type of evolved ape, and our intuitions and our minds evolve not for doing what we're doing now, but for surviving on the savannah and procreation and, a sort of biological backdrop. And we seem to be, lucky enough to have sort of hacked into intellectual capacities that now enable us to do things that are completely alien to our evolutionary context. And here we are, right? So on the one hand, that evolutionary context makes me quite confident that we are in a shared reality. There probably is something objective out there, and that we can, working together with degrees of confidence, probabilistically, provisionally, come to an understanding about our shared world. But at the same time, with the humility you talked about, recognizing the limitations of our perception, our cognitive abilities, the chances that we might be deluded, and having that as a humility that keeps us always open-minded and uncertain. I find that sort of middle path that doesn't fall into either trap sort of compelling. But
I think this is yes, exactly. It's one way of putting it. It's a way I often uses, and it's one that Dan Dennett often used, is to appeal to Wilfred Sellers' distinction between the manifest image of the world and the scientific image. The manifest image being the world as we take it to be, the world as it were presents itself to us.
Yeah.
The world of colors and other people and their values, and the world that if you like, that philosophy, if you like, traditionally tries to make sense of, the world as it's presented to us. And then the scientific image, the image of the world that's constructed by scientific inquiry and theorizing, which says that a lot of these elements of the manifest image at least don't have the sort of salience that they seem to have for us. Colors, for example, don't show up in the same way in the scientific image. It's not that there's nothing there that corresponds to them, but they don't show up in the same way.
Yeah.
And aspects of the mind, I suppose, as they appear in the manifest image, don't quite appear in the scientific image, in the image of, say, of neuroscience. Now, the trick is to try and bring these images into some sort of harmony. This image, it's the product of an evolutionary process, I think, including perhaps cultural evolution. But it's an image that's adaptive for us to have. It's a way of taking the world, a way of carving up the world, of categorizing things and reacting to things that make sense for us, given the kind of creatures we are. So, I mean, the solid objects, middle-sized objects, which are not just clouds of subatomic particles or whatever. That's how we see it, because that's the image of the world as solid, middle-sized objects that we need. The scientific image, it's driven by a desire to find a more, and so this image is very much human relative, species relative. It's relative to our needs, and as the kind of beings we are. The scientific image tries to abstract away from that human specificity and tries to get a more impartial, objective picture of things. Now, how do we bring these two into harmony? we could just say, well, just throw that one out, just trust the science, just go with the scientific, just throw that out. That's all that's a kind of evolved sort of illusion, as it were. And I don't think we can do that. This is the world we inhabit. This is the world we're designed to inhabit. This is our world. This is the world of feelings and love and the richness of sensory experience and so on. All of this. That's all. We can't throw that away. That's where we live. That's our niche. That's what we've evolved to live in. That's the image of the world. That's the human image of the world, or perhaps more broadly, the biological image of the world. It's a world that's relative, that's framed for us by evolutionary processes. So we can't throw that away. I mean, and if we did, we'd cease to be human. But at the same time, we can't deny the power of the scientific image. The scientific image, it kind of works. It's getting at something deep and I'm not going to say fundamental, but it's getting at something deep and potent. We can, you can do stuff with science that you can't do within the manifest image. All of our technology depends on the robustness of that image. So we don't want to we can't sort of bend that to make it fit this. We can't say we've got to, this is so obviously important to us that our conception of color say that we've got to change the science, or that we have this idea of, say, there are mental powers or forces or something like this. So we've got to add extra forces into the science, into the physics. You can't do that. You can't do that. So the trick is to kind of see them as harmonizing, as not conflicting, that there are two perspectives on the same reality, different perspectives constructed on the same reality. Now, that may mean making revisions to how we understand, particularly to how we understand the manifest image. It may mean rethinking it a bit. Things like free will, for example. Free will seems to be part of our conception of ourselves, that we can act in a way that's uncaused. We can originate sequences of action from within ourselves with no prior cause. It's how it kind of seems to us.
Yeah.
And that seems to be part of the manifest image. You can't get that into the scientific image. I'm pretty sure you can't.
No.
So, but that doesn't mean we have to throw out free will. That would be too radical a step. I think what we need to do is rethink it a little bit. Rethink what it means to have this kind of free will that's important to us. And we can do that by thinking about it in terms of self-control and autonomy and the nature of the causes of our actions, and that these are causes that we have, causal process that we have cultivated, and habits, for example, that we have cultivated.
And as part of that, reconceiving of it as a psychological phenomena rather than maybe one that has any relevance to fundamental physics.
I would say yes, very much.
Yeah.
It's understanding how and why we have this perspective, and what we can do with that perspective, and which bits of that perspective. I mean, suppose it was part of that perspective. I mean, it isn't really, but suppose that something like telepathy or telekinesis were part of that perspective. We'd have to let that go. But it isn't, and it isn't for very good reasons, that this perspective evolved to do work for us. Okay, so it doesn't have wholly spurious stuff in it. Okay, because such stuff could do no work. So look at something like belief desire psychology. We ascribe beliefs and desires to each other, and we explain and predict each other's behavior in terms of beliefs and desires. Now, this is just standard. How did I know that when I turned on the computer at the start of our interview that you'd be there? Because I knew that you believed we had an interview at that time and that you wanted to do that interview, and so I predicted you'd be there. Hi, you were. It's very hard to get that prediction from looking at data about your brain, say, no matter how extensive it would be. We're very far simpler. So this is doing real predictive work. But at the same time, you may say, well, where do you find beliefs in the brain? Where do you find can the neuroscience locate these beliefs and desires? Well, this was, Dennett's great insight in this. That you don't need to do that to if you like, vindicate this common sense perspective. Talk of beliefs and desires that needn't be picking out actual discrete states and processes within the brain. It's enough that it picks out a pattern in your behavior, a pattern in your reaction to the world.
Is there still an in principle view that, they are actually in the brain, right? If in some sense, right, you may not need to have that bottom up linkage now, but at least in principle, these are part of one integrated world, and there isn't some sort of radical separation between the manifest and the scientific, or the subjective and the objective.
Well, there definitely isn't on Dennett's view. There definitely isn't, but it's where you look for these things in the scientific image. There could be discrete storage of bits of information and bits of goals and so goal structures and things within the brain. That could be, but it doesn't look very likely. And the point is, there doesn't need to be, because what this talk is doing is, this talk isn't sort of proto-neuroscience or proto-cognitive psychology. It's a way of, it's a tool for interacting with other people, for making predictions about where people will be at certain times. And for what it needs to do, so it needs to be tracking, to be able to get to be useful to us, it needs to be tracking something real. It needs to, but it's enough, as Danny points out, that it's tracking patterns in people's behavior. We talk about somebody desiring something is a highly compressed and informative way of talking about how they will be disposed to react to all kinds of different situations. If you,
it's operating at a certain level.
It's a picking out a pattern
yeah.
in their behavior and in their interactions with us. And so what we need to do is in bringing these images into harmony, we may need to reconceptualize aspects of the manifest image. And we also need to understand why we have that image, what work it's doing for us. And so let's talk about colors, metaphysics of colors. You can, colors are very puzzling things for philosophers, and you can take the manifest image, the colors that are out there, they're on the surfaces of things, they seem simple, and the primitive qualities of things, and they're out there and they're independent of me. That's how they're presented, how the manifest image presents them, as it were. Presents isn't the word I like. That's how we take them. That'd be better. And then if you try and do philosophy on that, you get yourself in all sorts of tangles and so on. But a better question, I think, would be, how have we evolved this way of this way of interacting visually with the world, that which has, I want to be careful how I phrase this now. Okay, for which we use color talk.
Yeah.
That's not a very good way of putting it. What is this way of taking the world that evolution has equipped us with, this way of visually taking it color-wise? Oh, goodness me. Why has evolution equipped us with this ability? And what exactly are we tracking when we track the things we call colors? How is our brain doing? Why are we inclined to say the things we are inclined to say about colors, such as that they're simple and they stand in certain relations to each other and so on? These are all really productive questions which you can answer. And once you start to approach it that way, I think the idea that there's going to be so there are features out there, there's our sensitivity to these features, and then there's responses to those features, what detecting those features, what effects detecting those features has on us, what significance, say, red has for us, or emotional significance, perhaps, whatever, which could be quite variable from person to person. Take all that into account, and then you kind of understand more of the mechanics of the manifest image, and therefore in a position to see how it harmonizes with the scientific image. That you can see that science is really talking about the same processes, but with a different vocabulary and with a different theoretical framework, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. Rather than taking the alternative approach, which would almost carve the subjective and the manifest image off as a completely distinct aspect of reality.
That's how you get dualisms. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Fascinating.
Thank you. Get problems of free will. How you get. The ultimate thing that we see people are quite happy to say, well, take color. People are quite happy to say, well, colors aren't really out there. Okay, what's really out there are surface reflectance profiles of surfaces, and which reflect or indeed emit light of
wavelengths and
wavelengths or whatever. And people are quite happy to say that because they there's a way you can still hang on to the reality of colors as they figure in the manifest image as these simple qualities that have a feel all of their own. And that is by saying, well, they're not really out there, but they are somewhere, so they must be in here. Now, once you make that move, you've taken this element of the manifest image, the color element, you've taken it out of its proper location in the manifest image, which is in the world around us, and put it into some other place, which it's not wholly clear what this other place is. It's probably another part of the manifest image, the mind, if you like, the subjective world, and you've put it in there. So already you've done some distortion on the manifest image there, and you've got these colors that are in the mind now. And now you have this question, okay, so now how do we reconcile that with the scientific image of the mind, insofar as the science thinks of the mind essentially as a brain, a functioning brain. Okay. So how then do you get these colors? Which now the very reasons for thinking that the colors couldn't really be out there, well, the reasons that science gives have equally reasons for thinking that they can't be in the brain, because the brain is no more colored than the rest of the world. So now you really have a problem, and you have a hard problem, in fact. And the only way to deal with this is either it's to say that the scientific image isn't a complete image of what's happening, and so you need to add either some new science or some metaphysical dimension that's not really part of science at all. That's some further dimension of reality.
Yeah.
And you can go down that route, but another way is to sort of explore exactly how our sense of what colors are and where they are and their nature, and that maybe it's in some respects misleading. As Dennett would say, the way is not to say that colors aren't out there but in here. It's to say something like colors are out there, but they're not what we think they are.
Yeah.
And then what you have to explain is why we think they're something else.
Yeah. And I think this is the fascinating tension, because I think many people would go along with your approach about recognizing the subjective and objective and, manifest and scientific image when it comes to everything outside of their mind, right? Everyone's quite comfortable with, that approach, right? There is a reality out there. We have a limited perspective on it. We can work together to work it. But as soon as you turn that lens onto the mind itself, that's where the tension arises. And it'll be good to dig into that more in a little bit as well.
It would, wouldn't it? Because, it would seem difficult to accept that, because we have this image of ourselves, of course, and that's a pretty important image to us as self-reflective creatures who don't just inhabit the world, but sort of inhabit their own minds. As I talked about,
as if it is a different world, as if it is a different domain. Yeah,
it's certainly a different aspect of the world. It's spatially separate from the rest of the world. It's sort of in here, although to some extent the mind may be extended. And it's a curious aspect of the world. But I think if you take seriously the idea that we are evolved creatures that are wholly part of the world, we're not immaterial souls. We're not some extra we don't inhabit some separate realm from the physical world.
We're not magic. We're
not magic, and that it's not the case that as evolution progressed, something magical really did happen. There was an extra dimension of reality came into existence at some point inside the brains of living creatures. And where would that have happened in the evolutionary sequence? If you balk at that, and I do, then the interesting question, then the thing to do is not to say, well, so let's just dismiss all this talk about the subjectivity and the privacy of the mind and what happens in my mind. You can't do that. I mean, when we talk about these things, we're not talking about nothing. We're talking about very, very important things.
Yeah.
Extremely important things, in some ways the most important things to us, our own subjective lives. But we need to this reconceptualization of what it is to have a subjective life in such a way that an evolved biological being could have one. And it's got to be, in some sense, a construction of the brain. It's got to be, just as the brain constructs, as it were, a manifest image of the world, it constructs a manifest image of itself and its own activities, which is going to be simplified, distorting, through what we might call introspection rather than perception. It constructs an image of what it is itself doing, monitors itself, monitors its own activities. And again, and the trick is then not to throw that manifest image out, the inner manifest image, as it were, but again, to see how we can harmonize it with the scientific one. And that won't weaken it. That won't sort of somehow undermine it and reduce the importance of this subjective perspective we have on the world. Far from it. It will show that it's solid and and a genuine part of the reality that science itself maps. Treating it as something distinct from the science, something from the world mapped by science, is dangerous because it's now putting it at risk of complete falsification by science. And if, as science progresses, we find there's less and less work for this dualistic aspect to do,
maybe even
then the
nothing.
conclusion would be it doesn't exist, just as people have done away with the soul.
Yeah, and
to bring it into.
And I'm very much an amateur in these spaces, but you will find quite a lot of physicists who will explore these ideas and will say, look, I'm sorry, but our current models, of course there's still uncertainty. Of course we need to do more work in physics. Of course we haven't unified quantum physics and gravity, but the models we have today in physics are so mind-bendingly robust when laid against the physical evidence we have, and it's so overwhelming that there actually is no space for anything else. And I guess that's part of the process you're talking about there, is that if that space gets squeezed and squeezed and squeezed until there's nothing, can that be a dangerous, almost destruction of what people think of as subjectivity, the mind, the self? And
exactly, you see people, scientifically minded people, who say, so we've got to throw out free will, for instance. We've got to throw out the notion of free will. They might say we've got to throw out the notion of consciousness, so on. We don't. We have to rethink them a little bit, rethink what it is to have free will, rethink what it is to be conscious.
Yeah.
Okay.
Reconceive them, not
rethink
deny
what
them.
It is for things to be colored. That's the process that I'm on. I'm not trying to. People see me sometimes, I think, as trying to deny the reality of consciousness. I'm trying to save it. I'm trying to save it from an inflated dualistic and conception that threatens to remove it. Because if you inflate it into something that can't exist in a physical world, then there's danger that at some point people are going to go, well, but this is so powerful, the scientific perspective is so powerful, so robust, as you said, that there's no place in it for this, and it will go like the soul. We don't want consciousness to go.
Yeah.
We want to but that means thinking again about what our image of ourselves is doing for us psychologically, not just taking it that this is how things seem to me, this is how my mind seems to me, that's how the mind must be, that's bedrock, that's it, can't be questioned. No, think about, why does my mind seem to be that way to me?
Yeah.
What does that image of myself, what's its function? Why did I come to have that image? Did evolution equip me with it, as Nick Humphrey thinks, for very good reasons? He thinks it's adaptive to have this almost dualistic image of ourselves. Is it a product of culture? If so, what cultural forces engendered it, and for what reasons? How do we come to have it? That's the interesting question. Just starting with it is like, it's going back to how do things work? How does the motor car work? It's just saying it's a motor car, it works, no further explanation. I wouldn't want to go that way.
Yeah. And I think that psychological approach is really interesting. And some people will resist it and push back on it, though, because they'll say, look, the way humans psychologize about these concepts isn't relevant to the evidence base of whether, this hypothesis is true or this is hypothesis true. And that's fair enough to some degree, right? But when the thing you're talking about is itself a psychological construct, it's at least highly relevant to think about, why we as evolved apes have certain patterns of thinking and lead us in certain directions. And people are very used to doing this when you're thinking about, whether there's an evolutionary genesis for spirituality and religion. Is it advanced agency detection? Is it looking for higher powers? Is it looking for simple answers? And I think you can apply those same sort of heuristics and understanding of human patterns and evolved ways of thinking to at least understand why the hypotheses might have formed that take concepts like consciousness, which, obviously are absolutely of central importance to who we are, right? It's almost, that is who we are, and why psychologically we might want to reify that as something that is in the external world or separate it in some way. It's psychologically, it's very intuitive, but at the same time, I find it fascinating because I've actually had obviously you co-host the Mind Chat podcast with a very well-known panpsychist, or somebody who favors panpsychism, Philip Goff, and I've had the pleasure of talking to quite a lot of panpsychists on the podcast, people like Luke Roloff and David Pearce and even Christoph Koch, sort of, I don't know, maybe a bit more idealist than panpsychist Emerson Green. And it's interesting because I think there are, so they take a different stance from you, clearly, which again is separate from the dualist ones. The dualist one is, look, it's a completely separate type of thing, as I understand it. The panpsychist one is more about saying, actually, the foundation of physics and reality and nature itself is actually consciousness. So it's a sort of mind first idea, and there's loads of different varieties of it. But it seems to me that there's still a few different paths psychologically you can use to get to that place. Now, one is, I'm quite sympathetic to your view, right? So you'll feel my bias is coming through, and anyone who watches this who's more of a panpsychist approach might feel annoyed by this. But there can be quite an arrogant approach to panpsychism, which is reifying human consciousness in the same way as we love to put humans at the center of the universe, right? It's the classic Copernican thing, right? We do it. We are the center of the universe. Everything is about us. And it feels like there's an arrogant approach where you say, well, our human consciousness is super important. So I'm now going to declare it's not just in our brains, but is also foundational to physics and also primordial, such that even 13.7 billion years before, humans even existed, consciousness was right there at the beginning too, right? So that's maybe an arrogant path. But there's also a super humble approach, which is saying that, in a way, there isn't really anything that special about human consciousness or, consciousness of non-human animals. It's actually super pervasive. It's everywhere and everything. And all we've really done is, through an evolutionary process, collected and combined those pieces of micro consciousness into where we are now. So there's different psychological paths to it. And I think there's different epistemological paths as well. So some are drawn to panpsychism because it does have that sort of sense of a soul or a mystical essence or something transcendent. But others, and I think Luke Roloff is one of those examples, he's like, no, I'm completely down the line naturalistic, evidence and reason, I'll change my mind. And he favors a panpsychist view for various reasons. But in my conversation, that also led him to say, well, because of that stance, his second favored option would actually be quite an aggressive sort of materialistic illusionist type stance, because his way of thinking about that almost comes back closer to some aspects of your thinking, because both of you are saying there isn't some radically distinct thing here. In a way, there is a unity or an identity between, I don't know.
Yeah,
I should stop rambling, but
I think that's right. I think Luke is very clearly on the more modest path that you mentioned, and because he's a universalist, he thinks that every collection of particles is forms a macro consciousness. I believe I'm not misrepresenting him in saying that. It means that this notion of consciousness is kind of, ethically at least, pretty much insignificant, because it's absolutely everywhere. And so, if you like the difference, and I think that he would agree with me that it's the complex psychological states that are of moral significance, that are of ethical significance. It's when you get the fundamental stuff organized into complex mechanisms of sensitivity and reaction, that you get things that are morally of interest, as opposed to when you get these things organized in, say, rocks, or when you get these consciousnesses in rocks and so on. So really, and so in a way, it's just, well, I suppose we both agree that there's some sort of stuff that everything's made of. And it's whether he calls that stuff conscious and I call it non-conscious. But I don't.
And one of my earlier guests, J.C. Rees, I think wrote the paper almost suggesting that could this end up just being a semantic debate rather than one of substance? I don't know if you'd go that far, but
I can. That's. I mean, Luke has a really nice paper in Clesis, which gets close to that view, and he clearly understands what the illusionists are up to better than most people do. I'm not sure though, because the key difference, I think, is that, I mean, he does, and at the end of that paper, articulate a clear difference. And I won't try to reproduce the argument here because I will get it wrong. But I think the difference is that panpsychists and what I call phenomenal realists, they trust certain intuitions about our own minds, certain aspects, if you like, of the manifest self-image, in a way that illusionists don't. Illusionists are more willing to admit that we may be wrong, that introspection may be wrong.
And that ties back maybe in an unfair way to this idea of revelation for me. I do sometimes wonder if there's a sense of overweighting that revelatory experience in the same way as someone who's had a religious experience might, where they're not someone who has a religious experience is more weighting the information in that experience, whereas I think a phenomenal realist or panpsychist is maybe, you might say, overweighting the experience itself, the existence of the experience itself.
But I like that, yes. And Philip, he does indeed use the term revelation in the sense that he thinks that introspection reveals the essence of the properties being introspected, the phenomenal properties.
It's direct, incontrovertible, ineffable.
It tells you that in the case of pretty much everything else, we say, well, we can recognize gold or water or whatever it may be, but we have to defer to science to tell us what gold and water really are. They have if you like, a hidden nature that explains their appearance. And the idea is that in the case of consciousness and their conscious properties, qualia, or whatever you want to call them, there isn't a hidden nature. Their full nature is directly revealed to us. Now, that is, so the issue then, and they have a name for this relation that we stand into these properties. They call it acquaintance, and it's supposed to be an epistemically basic relation. It's not mediated by any detection mechanism. It's not like we've got a qualia detector in our brains that detects qualia. We just, by the very fact that these qualia are instantiated in our brains, we know them somehow. Although who knows them? Who's we here? It's not clear that the we here can be the biological organism, because that would need a detector, right? So it's got to be, if you're not careful, this is going to lead you into something like a substance dualism, where there is an immaterial self that is directly acquainted with the immaterial qualia. I think it's very hard to avoid going in that direction, because this notion of acquaintance, that you can have a subject that can know something in an unmediated way, I don't see how you can give a naturalistic explanation of that.
Yeah.
It's got to be somehow that, how can that sort of self-knowledge is an achievement. Know yourself. Know yourself. That's hard work. It's not just, your nature isn't just revealed to yourself, I don't think.
Yeah.
So I think, yes, it's the trust in that, the nature of that fundamental revelation of the essence of I was going to say of existence, but I mean of experience, but I suppose of existence too. That's where we differ.
Yeah. And I think the nub of the issue is, I think they would absolutely acknowledge that the content of consciousness might be warped or deluded or so on, or illusory, but the existence of the consciousness itself can't be an illusion. And so, when I talk to some people about illusionism, they will say, well, I can understand that I might be experiencing things that are illusions, but to even experience an illusion implies I must be experiencing, which is they'll say that's the one thing that can't be an illusion is.
Well, hang on.
I know you've gone through this hundreds of times. But
this is, well, look, there's an experience. Look, there are these states, okay, that occur in us that we call experiences, perceptions, whatever, and they involve us typically as being stimulated by external stimuli hitting our sense organs and triggering all sorts of things that happen in us. And science, neuroscience can tell you an awful lot about that and what happens. And we can recognize when we're having experiences where I can say, I'm now tasting coffee, I'm now seeing the blue sky, I'm now hearing a violin or whatever. So we can recognize when we're having the experiences, we can compare them one with another. We can say that this experience is like the one I had when the taste of this is like the taste of, I can say all these things about experience. This is all uncontroversial. These experiences matter to us. Some experiences we don't like being in at all. We strive very hard to get out of those states. Others we like being in, and we try to seek them out and cultivate them. Yeah, absolutely. All this is absolutely uncontroversial. I'm not suggesting that those things are illusionary. I'm suggesting that we conceptualize them. We misconceptualize them as states that we know in a very special way, that have a kind of quality that's very different from any of the other qualities, any of the other properties that science recognizes, that pose a problem, a hard problem of how they can fit into the world as science describes it. We conceptualize them in that way. And we use labels like the what it is likeness, the feel, the qualis, what is like, qualia, phenomenon, with all sorts of terminologies. And what I'm suggesting is that what we're doing in these cases is misconceptualizing a really complex cognitive, psychological, neural process of interaction with the world as a simple, directly, which we are aware of through mechanisms of self-monitoring. We misconceptualize that as a simple, unstructured feel that we are immediately aware of. And it's that misconceptualization. That's where the illusion comes in. I say illusion for a very good reason. Illusions, I'm not saying hallucination. I don't say they don't exist. Illusions are when things aren't the way they seem to us. What do I mean by now? Somebody will immediately say, but if it seems to you a certain way, then that means there's a certain quality to it. No, by seem here, I mean that we judge to be a certain way, that we take to be a certain way. I mean the seeming itself to be understood in psychological terms as a cluster of judgments, beliefs, other reactions to that state. It seems that way if I respond to that state. I'm under an illusion of something being the case if I respond as if that thing were the case. Okay, it's if I form the beliefs and the other reactions and so on that I would form if that thing were really the case. Okay. Similarly, I say that qualia are an illusion because we form the beliefs and we have the other reactions that we would have if we were the ones that we would have if we were directly acquainted with qualia. That the illusion consists in the downstream effects.
Got it. Yeah.
So that's. Sorry, I tried to pack in an awful lot there.
No, it's brilliant. It's very dense, but I think I think it really cuts to the heart of it, because so much of the debate seems to dance around the edges, and I think this is the core.
Sort of, I've got all sorts of little bits of scripts and lectures and things in my head, and bits of them sort of
triggered.
Here's an interesting thing: that multiple drafts of what I want to say are competing with each other to come out. And so I'll start on one sometimes, and there's other bit will say, no, but you need to put this in first. And then that bit will come out. Interestingly, I will sometimes be aware of that process. Now, what do I consciously want to say?
You'll find out as you listen to yourself.
I have to wait and see what comes out. The thing is, once it's come out, I kind of have to stand by it, or go back and say, no, wait a minute, I got that completely wrong. And there are bits of that I didn't express well. So you see, I'm kind of making up myself as I go along. I'm making up my opinions, in a sense, I'm making up my experience, because I'm choosing what to focus on, what to incorporate again into a narrative about myself. I am, to some extent, I see myself this way, a narrative construction. I am what I present myself to myself as.
It's a fascinating lens. And I think I've also heard you talk about this idea about, we should be as skeptical of our own self-reporting and our self-monitoring as we are about external reports. What really is the difference between those? Whereas, yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Well,
If you take seriously the idea there's no magic, then yes, introspection is going to be as fallible as perception.
Yeah.
Perhaps more so.
So that's been wonderful to dig into, because I think, obviously it's the core of a major theme of your work, and we don't normally spend much time talking about the epistemology, but it's so important, because the epistemology of how we come to understand the mind is absolutely central to the next questions about ethics. Because one of the reasons why I think people are so scared about how we conceive of the mind is because it is of deep ethical importance to most people. And to some people, it's the absolute center of ethics. Without mind, without consciousness, without sentience, why does anything matter? So I think it's that ethical worry that partly drives some of the, epistemological thinking about what is the nature of this thing that is supremely important to us. So I sometimes ask these questions separately, but maybe it'd be more productive to munge them together. But it is the big questions of ethics, right? It's sort of what matters, but also who matters. So again, I'd be interested, if there is a story about, through your life, how did you come to think about good and bad and right and wrong, and what do these things really mean? I know you're not an ethicist, but even in a sort of sense of the grounding of ethics, if you think there is such a thing, how have you come to think about that, and how much does that tie into your conceptions of mind and consciousness and sentience and what they are?
Yeah, I've never been too preoccupied with theoretical questions about ethics. The struggle for me is always, I've generally felt that I have a pretty good sense of what I ought to do or not to do. The struggle has been to do it. It's been practical. It's not been theoretical. It's not been that. There haven't been a lot of occasions in my life, I think, where I've had a great theoretical struggle as to what is the right thing to do.
So what's the intuitive sense of what's the right thing to do? How would you describe that?
Well,
Even in common
I think
sense terms about,
we have evolved ethical instincts. We're social creatures. I don't think the world comes sort of stamped with ethical value. And I think that's maybe one reason people want to have these intrinsic qualities to experience, because they think they might be the coin of fundamental value. I don't think that's the way. I don't think the world comes with values built in. I think values emerge for creatures. It's only once you get organisms that things of the world start to matter to other bits of the world. Before there was any life, there was just matter doing its things, and no bit of the world mattered to any other bit of the world. Asteroids would crash into planets, and there'd be stars would explode and things, but none of this mattered to anything. It's only once you get organisms that have a kind of integrity and that are striving to sustain their integrity over time and to reproduce. It's only when you get that, when you get a little bit of the world that sort of carves itself off into with a little membrane around it and separates itself off into a little world that has its own dynamics.
and a boundary between
itself
and other.
Physics, exactly. And now things outside that boundary start to have meaning for it, because they can be threats, they can be opportunities, they can threaten its existence, or they can then promote it. Things start to matter, and I think that's the origins of value. And then as you get more and more complex kinds of creatures, you get more and more complex kinds of value. Things start to matter in all sorts of different ways. You get, and it goes in different ways. If you take creatures like a creature like bees that live in colonies, it's really the interests of the colony that matter. rather than the interests of the individual bee and or individual ant or what it is, whatever it is. And so they will quite readily sacrifice, individual sacrifice itself for the sake of the colony, because the colony matters to it in a way that its own individual existence doesn't. It is more like an organ of the colony. But then you get more individual. Other creatures are much more individual. They have their own individual. They exist more independently. That's what I'm trying to say. And some of these are predators, and then the lives of their prey don't matter to them very much. In fact, they matter to them only as a source of food. And that's not to say they're making some ethical error. That's just what matters to a lion is, it gets its food. I don't think it's mistaking a source of value there that it should be respecting.
Even though there is, in some sense, clearly a moral harm being done and a being that is impacted negatively
from our perspective.
Our perspective, and from the perspective of the prey.
From the perspective of the prey, certainly. It certainly matters from the perspective of the prey. But what I'm saying is things matter from perspectives. That's my point. Certainly, it matters very much from the perspective. It's got a great deal of value.
So things matter because they matter to someone, but they also matter from a certain perspective.
But then, of course, you get social animals like us, where not only do we matter to ourselves, but other people matter to us because we're social animals. And so we have social instincts. And living an ethical life, I think, is simply if you like, an elaboration of these instincts in the light of one's own personality and one's own individual. We are also, as well as being social, we're also highly autonomous and we're self-reflective. So we don't just have these instincts, we can also reflect on those instincts. And we can reflect on how they manifest themselves. And we can reflect on what kind, we can do this thing that other creatures cannot do, really. We can reflect on ourselves and we can ask questions about our value to ourselves, which aren't just questions about survival. We can ask whether because we have these social attitudes, so we judge others. Okay, so if people don't contribute properly to the community, we disapprove of them and so on, and we approve of the heroic acts that people do for the community and so on. We can apply those to ourselves. We can decide whether we think we are good members of the community or whether we are good in ourselves. We can just sort of internalize these social notions, and we can start to tell ourselves stories about ourselves that may be good stories or bad stories. We may start to feel guilt, and well, of course, guilt itself is a social instinct and so on. But we can elaborate these through stories we tell and through experiences we have and through all sorts of cultural influences. And I think it's just what we talk about in moral life is just an elaboration of all that. And then, of course, we can start to do philosophy and try and systematize all this mess and try and reduce it to a few principles and try and do meta-ethics and try and elucidate some core principles that structure all of this or that should structure all of this. I'm skeptical of that because I don't think it's that kind of subject. That is just distorting it. And the idea, for instance, that there should be an answer to moral conundrums, I think no, sometimes things just conflict and there's no right way out. There's just
Well,
I suppose I'm a virtue ethicist insofar as I'm anything.
Okay, thank you. That's fascinating, and I'm sympathetic to that. I don't think the universe has sort of an inbuilt ethics, and I don't think anyone owes us a perfect, easy ethical answer to. Some things just are intractable and extremely difficult, and we may not have any good choices in front of us. But at the same time, I'm nervous about falling back too much into the sort of descriptive pattern, because there is a stance which says, look, descriptively, morality and ethics was an evolutionary thing. You can think about the mother caring for their child. You can think about intergroup conflict and cooperation. That's led us to have psychological predilections that, may give us out-group aggression, but they also give us compassion and care for each other as well. And so I think that's an appropriate descriptive story. Of course, if you just leave it there, that can lead you to some pretty awful naturalistic fallacies about things that are good, that, nature is not a good place, right? Nature is not a good moral guide. It's a brutally amoral system that includes many horrors, right? So you sort of can't lead with, ethics is whatever is evolutionarily adaptive, because that leads you to some very dark, bleak places. So then there is this process you were talking about, which is, spinning, twisting it, challenging it, using philosophy to try and conceptualize things, and maybe in that add in ideas about consistency and coherence and views from nowhere or whatever it might be, right? And I think we need to be humble about, like you say, I don't think that's going to take us to any perfect mathematical spreadsheet answer, but I think that is a deeply important exercise that we have to do to take us from the descriptive into something normative, where we can have a stance about good and bad and right and wrong. So I don't want to downplay it. I also don't want to be naive about what that might be able to achieve. And
no, I agree. I agree with you.
And one of the central questions that I focus on hard in this conversation is that question of moral scope and who gets to matter, because I think there's quite a lot of common sense agreement about morality amongst humans. Of ultimately, it's about morality in some sense is about caring for others, whether we do that through virtue or rights or justice or feminist care ethics or on, but it's basically about whether and how we care for others. So then the question is, which others should we care about? And I obviously have a bias here because I'm putting sentientism forward as a stance that not only suggests all sentient beings should matter, but they should matter seriously in our moral consideration, not just in a tokenistic way, but in a meaningful way. And I also suggest, maybe there's a baseline moral consideration or a moral obligation that flows from sentience, which might be something like non-maleficence. So it doesn't say you have to be benevolent, you don't have to necessarily go out of your way to sacrifice to help, but at least we should try to avoid needlessly harming, killing, or exploiting any sentient being as a baseline. So that's my sort of biased, that's my aspiration and stance, is to say that if we care about any other and we want to be consistent and coherent, shouldn't we care about all the others? And that, for many people, can feel quite intuitive, but then it obviously clashes into many things us humans have come to think of as normal. So how do you think about that moral scope question? Because again, virtue ethics can be taken in lots of different directions there, right? You can be kind to those around you, or you can be kind in extension to every sentient being, or...
Well, let me say two things. First, about a normative dimension. I don't think this is incompatible with giving reasons for concern. So if someone said, why should I invest more time in my daughter's education than in someone else's education? I think saying because she's my daughter is a perfectly good reason. I know they've been saying, but why does that matter? Well, of course, we're going to run out at some point because it's going to say, well, that's just how I am, And I think saying, because it feels, why should we not harm this creature because it feels, because it's sentient, I think it's a perfectly good reason. And that's so that our ethical instincts can give us reasons for all sorts of things. At some point, you're going to come back to just, well, because that's just what I care about. And there's another way in which I think...
Yeah, there's some ultimate sense in which it might just be a choice, right? And we can argue about whether those choices are based on good reasons, but it might just be a choice in the end, yeah.
And I think that's important. I think one of the aspects of... okay, I was going to say I think this is something that ethicists tend to ignore, that may be unfair, is to the extent to which moral life does involve an element of choice, or more correctly, of commitment. You can say, well, look, you can't provide me with some sort of a deductive argument from the unquestionable premises to the conclusion that I should care about the welfare of this or that creature or whatever. But I'm going to make a commitment to that. I'm going to say, no, well, it matters to me.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just, that's where I stand. It matters to me. And if you say, well, why does it matter to you? You say, well, because that's the kind of person I am, and that's what I've decided to incorporate into my sense of who I am, a sense of my of the sort of person I am, and how I live in the world.
And you might have got there through
perfect. Yeah.
And you might have got there through intuition or a sense of felt compassion or an intellectual exploration or philosophical work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It does. It does. The point is, I mean, we may not know how. I mean, we don't have. I think we're often quite blind to our own motives, or perhaps motives isn't quite the right word, promptings, the things that prompt us to take certain decisions and actions. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that it's something it doesn't matter what prompted you make the commitment. It's a question of whether you can live with it, and whether you do live with it, and whether you consistently say, yeah, this is a marker I'm going to steer by. And however I landed on that marker, the question is, as I live my life steering by it, am I happy with it? Is this making me feel that I'm living the way I want to live? And if it is, carry on steering by it. You can't. I don't think there are. I mean, there are moral facts relative to organisms. For social creatures, there are certain things that are clearly important for them that matter to them as social creatures. That's definitely. But there aren't moral facts just written into the code of the universe somehow. And qualia don't provide them either.
Thank you.
Then the question you asked was about the moral scope. Now, the one thing that illusionism contributes to this debate is it doesn't give you an answer, but it tells you what kind of information is relevant to the answer and how you find that information. And specifically, it denies that the answers to this lie in some inscrutable, essentially private world. That what it's like to be another animal is something that we can never really know, that we can only speculate about and theorize about. Philosophically theorize about in metaphysical ways. No, it says that we can know all the relevant facts about this the animal's existence are objectively determinable. It's the kind of the way that the animals engage in the world, the way that it's kind of sensitivities that it has, and the kind of reactions that it has, and whether it's flourishing, okay, and the nature of its interaction with the world. Is what's happening to it something is it putting it in a highly aversive state that it doesn't want to be in, that is triggering all kinds of negative reactions, that is impeding its flourishing, that is stopping it living the kind of life that it wants to live, or is it something that's doing the opposite and promoting that? These questions are perfectly objective questions that we can study. With proper theoretical framework, we need to do a lot of psychological study, experimentation to find out exactly what animals are sensitive to. Is a particular chemical toxic to a creature, we can find out what kind of scratching the nails on the blackboard. I find that they're painful to listen to. Does another creature? Well, we can find out. We can see what its reactions to. We do all sorts of batteries of psychological and physiological tests and see how it reacts to it. Yeah. Maybe it can't even hear that wavelength at all.
Look into the eyes of a puppy, or observe the behavior of a pig in a slaughterhouse. Or
exactly. It's all there if we just go and look. Yeah. And there are certain things we can know, for instance, that animals don't. So a lot of our suffering, I don't want to diminish animal suffering, but there are certain kinds of suffering that they are not. Non-human animals, that they are not liable to. They're not liable to worry about their finances, for instance. They're not liable to worry about the long-term consequences of disability that might result from an injury. I remember, this is a little story that affected me, that I think it's told by a vet, and it was about being called to a farm where a cat had been injured in some agricultural machinery, and the cat had lost its leg, or I think both its legs, maybe all four of its legs. And so obviously it was in a good deal of distress, but he took the cat, and there was not a lot that he could do for it, but he took it and he made it comfortable. I don't think he gave it any anesthetic at this point. He just made it comfortable, sat it down somewhere, and stroked it gently, and it started purring. And his point was that, sure, there's something dreadful that happened to this animal. Sure, it had been in pain, but it wasn't distressed by this accident in the way that a human would have been. It couldn't think, oh my God, I'm not going to be able to walk anymore. What's this going to mean? How am I going to catch mice? How am I going to stay alive? Are they going to put me to sleep in this thing? So that whole level of interpretation and self-reflection and so on that goes along with our distress, it just has the sort of the brute, immediate sensory distress and all the reactions that constitute that.
And it can work in both directions, I guess, as well. There's the classic thought experiment of a chimp going to the dentist, right? Whereas you and I would know that the dentist is acting in our benefit, that the pain will be over, that, the chimp would just experience the horror.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have lots of sources of relief from suffering that animals don't have. And Dent has a nice example of this. He says, imagine if you could take all the pain that you're going to suffer over the next year and condense it down into 5 minutes of extreme pain that you have just right now. Would you take that? And I think his intuition is that, yes, everybody would, because 5 minutes and it's over. The mere pain itself isn't, even though it's the same quantity of pain as you would have been spread over the whole year, the point is that spreading it out would have disrupted your activities and your life in all sorts of ways and caused all kinds of other sorts of suffering. Maybe a sort of low-grade headache for a week would have ruined that week, whereas a burst of absolutely intense headache pain, just now, get it over with. So his point is that it's all wrapped up in a much richer context of, for us at least, pain is wrapped up in suffering is a much kind of richer, multidimensional thing. And as you say, there are sources of relief available to us that aren't available to animals. But there is raw distress. And this is absolutely evident. I can tell when my dog is in pain to a moral certainty. I mean, okay, you can cook up skeptical examples. Maybe the universe was created 5 minutes ago. I don't know. But I know when my dog's in pain. And it matters to me because I can see plainly that it's in a state it doesn't want to be in, that it's in a state of distress objectively. And we can measure all sorts of measures of this distress. That, when you're in pain, what happens? Well, you can say, well, there's just this ineffable, horrible quality. Well, but look at the other things that happen. You can't focus your attention on anything but the source of the pain. You desperately want it to stop. You maybe have nausea. You find it difficult to move, to talk.
You might be learning not to do it again.
Exactly. All sorts of things are happening in you. All sorts of perfectly observable, detectable signs of distress, marks of distress. And my idea is essentially that when we talk about the pain, it's simply a catch-all term to recognizing all of those effects occurring within you.
Yeah. And my sense is that if you have whatever approach you take, if you have a naturalistic approach to thinking about mind and who has mind and who's conscious or who is sentient, that leads you very quickly to the stance you talked about before, where it was something that happened quite early in the biological evolutionary tree. Some of my other guests have talked about maybe the Precambrian being the point at which pathological complexity or unlimited associative learning or something maybe was this, to use a biblical term, the genesis of sentience in some sense, valence and value. And that also, because it was so early, leads you to quite a broad distribution of the beings that are sentient across our shared animal family tree. And there's really interesting work essentially doing the type of scientific thinking you were just explaining to try and work out where are the boundaries, are they fuzzy, is sentience multidimensional, are there gradings and so on. But it's so that leads many people to quite a broad attribution of sentience and therefore moral patiency that in shorthand for many people is just human and non-human animals as a rough starting point. And this is one of the really difficult test cases in human ethics that I never quite know how to navigate with my guests, but it is, I think, a fascinating test case where the theory of moral consideration for all of those non-human animals bumps very brutally up against social norms. So for me and others, it's led me to a particular stance about how I see the ethics of animal agriculture, for example, to lead me to want to boycott that. So it's taken me very directly to veganism. But that's quite a rare stance, even amongst humans who do genuinely care about non-human animals. So I don't know how comfortable you are explaining, I'm not here to audit your personal life choices, but I'm interested in how do you think about non-human animal ethics in this context where your philosophy of mind has led you to attribute consciousness and sentience quite broadly?
Let me just say a couple of things. Don't let me fail to answer that question. But let me just say a couple of things that fall out of what I was saying before. Which one is that my perspective on consciousness, or the perspective of people who, like me on this, means that all the relevant facts to the decision making, to the moral decision making, are available.
Yeah. Okay. There's nothing hidden.
There's nothing deeply hidden. I mean, it may not be easy to find out what it's like to be a bat, but you need to do a lot of study. You need to study bats. You need to go and talk to people who spend their lives studying bats. And
this is a tangent. Sorry to interrupt you. Because the what is it like to be a bat thing obviously looms large in the philosophy of mind generally. One thing I've thought of is, could it technically, in principle, at some point be possible for us to actually run a bat mind emulator in our own brains, that we could really experience what it's like to be them? If we could actually run exactly the same sort of functions or processes for a period of time, could that actually break the thought experiment? We could really imagine what it's like to be another being, or even each other.
I think we could, but I don't think that is matters, because even if we couldn't, it still wouldn't prove what the thought experiment wouldn't prove what it's meant to prove.
Yeah.
But actually we can. I mean, you can actually train yourself to do echolocation. You know, you can actually do that. It's not that hard. You can learn to do it. But so yes, so there are ways of getting yourself, I think, into animals' perceptual worlds that with what do you call it? What am I trying to say? What were add-ons?
Yes, enhancements
prostheses, or without them. But that isn't. But you can still think of a more outlandish example, like a snail or something or whatever. But that doesn't affect the point. My point is that third-person study, scientific study, will get you all the information you need just as well. The emulation is just a sort of shortcut to that. Now, so all the facts are available, but also there are going to be no bright lines here. There is a sort of bright line, I think, with humans, in that we get these self-reflective capacities and so we get into what we might call full-blown consciousness, including self-consciousness and so on, which is certainly a much richer phenomenon, both in positive and negative dimensions. But basic, because it was sentience, now, how do we want to define this? Now, there's no bright line, so we're going to go right down to, not just through the animals, but we're going to go into plants. So we're going to go right down to microorganisms, if you like, the microorganism that is a little world of its own, that has a boundary between itself and the outer world, and that things in that outer world matter to it. The salt, the grain of salt, it senses the grain of salt and withdraws because it's toxic to it. That, I would say, is not a totally different kind of, there's not some bright line between that and what you get in mammals and things like that. So how do you draw? You don't draw a line. There isn't a line to be drawn. And to be honest, if I'm to be honest, I'm not being honest. I would extend sources of, I would see sources of value in the inanimate world too. I think that just something being I don't know, a wonderful rock formation or something is a reason for not destroying it. That a stalactite that has developed over thousands upon thousands of years. I think the fact that it's kind of there and that it's
even independent of any observer or anyone experiencing.
I think if the last man on Earth, the last person on Earth who was leaving Earth on the last spaceship decided to go and smash up all the stalactites, he'd be a bit of a bastard, I would think. That's what. But I mean, you can value anything you like. I mean, if you so. But getting back to sentience, sentience is going to run off into areas where it will be completely impractical to have much concern for. The harmful bacteria and viruses and so on. But still, I think you can say, well, the fact that it's an organism that has interests, that is seeking to sustain itself and to go on, is a reason for saying, other things being equal, just leave it alone, let it get on with it. Of course, if it's producing horrible disease in me or something, then, well, let's take the antibiotic. But if it's just floating around there minding its own business, say on some alien planet, well, just leave it alone. I think that is a prima facie reason. The fact that the thing has interests and wants to sustain itself, and we're using want here in a very liberal, intentional stance sort of way. it's prima facie reason for not hurting it.
Yeah.
But that does mean that their interests of animals, of non-human animals, can be overridden by other things that we value. And now, how you do that trade-off,
as in intra-human ethics, right? I mean,
this is exactly, yes. I absolutely agree with you that I do eat meat. I live in a country where meat eating is absolutely central to the culture. I don't eat a lot of it, and I don't particularly like myself for eating it. I certainly do not like factory farming at all, and I think that I really think that we treat animals atrociously, and I think I should be doing more. I do feel wrong about that. I don't think I'm making the right trade-off. I'm quite happy and pleased to see people like you pushing on that, because I think it's right and good, and I think those of us who are too complacent and are not making, and are too lazy to steer by the correct the marker that they want to steer by should be prompted and pushed and made to feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, it's I find it a fascinating topic in terms of human psychology and sociology and politics as much as in ethics, because it is one of those, I think it's the perfect area where actually human intuitive ethics just does not tie up with most of the decisions we take. And sometimes the easier way into it is to put our personal choices to one side for a moment and just think about the ethics of the system in itself from the perspective of the beings going through those processes. And that helps us to achieve a certain ethical clarity that, maybe then we can take back to our personal activism and choices and so on. But I think it's starting from that perspective of what is it like to be them? What life would they like to lead, which is generally a long, happy life with their family, being unconstrained. And then setting that against whether it's factory farming or even non-factory farming, and doing the empathic exercise can be, almost thinking about the system can be a productive place to start.
I agree. I feel much less uncomfortable about very small scale farming. My aunt and uncle were very small scale farmers, and they had a pig, and they looked after the pig well. They treated it; it lived in luxury. But there did come a point where it was killed, but it was killed by. I don't think they killed it themselves. I think there was a person who came around who did the killing. Killed swiftly, quickly, and every bit of it was consumed in some way or another. Was used. Nothing was wasted. It's almost sort of medieval. It was used, and the pig was loved. The pig was treated well, and when it was killed, nothing was wasted, and it was used entirely for the family. No profit was made out of this. And I'm much happier with that than with factory farming, which is, I think, for one thing, the problem with one of the big big one about factory farming is that it's awful for the creatures, but also that we have a system, a structure where people are so distanced from what's happening. They lived with the pig, they knew the pig, they fed the pig, they patted the pig had babies, they looked after the babies, they showed the babies to the grandchildren. It was a part of the family. They were directly in touch, and yes, there's a nasty end, but they lived that and faced that and saw that and did that.
At least there was some integrity. At least there was some directness and integrity to that.
There was a directness and integrity to it, and they made that trade-off in full knowledge of what they were doing. We don't. This is the problem.
And it is a fascinating case, because I'm with you on the sort of factory farming thing. It's just an industrialized, impersonal process that clearly treats the beings within it purely as objects and commodities.
Exactly.
So there are definitely degrees, and there are also different contexts around the world where there are some human communities that would struggle to continue existing without exploitation of animals as well. So I do see that differentiation. At the same time, ethically, I'm, in a way, weird way, I can almost struggle more with the family situation than with the factory farm, because in the factory farm, it's impersonal. There are objects. We just turn the handle, and the artificial insemination happens, and the family separation happens, and the mutilation happens, and the slaughter happens, and the object comes out the other end. To actually carry out largely those same sorts of processes to a being that you treat as a family member and love, and you do that directly, it's odd, because in a sense, the lifetime experience of the animal is less bad than it would be in a factory farming. But from the human ethical standpoint, it feels more like a betrayal. And, you can imagine if you take the thought experiment and did it in a human instance, the words would just not be used in that way. You wouldn't say we cared, we loved, they were part of the family. And then, there's I don't want to drag you through it, but there's something odd there, that it almost feels like there's a stronger betrayal when a relationship has been built up and where there is genuine love and compassion, than when you treat someone as an object from start to finish, even though the latter causes much more harm overall.
I can see that, but I suppose what I would say is something like that to some extent, the love and the whatever were projections of human relationships onto this. I don't think the pig kind of reciprocated and understood that there was this, it was just being treated nicely and patted and given the food and so on and talked to nicely. I don't think he understood.
And I'm sure they appreciated that part of the process. Yeah.
I don't think he felt that there was some sort of, that it was part of a social, that it was part of a family, that it knew what a family is. That
I'd be less confident of that. I think certainly with many of the mammals, their ability to develop relationships and connections is.
We certainly can with dogs, because they've evolved to do that. They've really evolved to be part of human families, and it absolutely wouldn't work with a dog. That sort of line of thinking wouldn't work with a dog. Precisely because they do understand these notions of loyalty and being part of a I suppose a small pack. Yeah. They definitely understand that. So yes, I agree. I mean, I think there's a legitimate thing, but my point was more that in these cases, whatever you make of the trade-off that people make who eat meat, at least in those cases, they're completely clear about what it is, what's happening, and the reality of the trade-off they're making.
There is a directness and honesty.
Whereas it's the distance from it that troubles me, beside, of course, from the absolute brutality of the whole process. But I feel that people are not aware of the trade-off they're making, and that's. I mean,
it's an additional problem, isn't it? It's like the next order problem. Yeah.
Here in Greece, that sort of relation with animals, I think, is much more common. A lot of people are not so far away from a village style of life where they would have animals close to them. A lot of people here, even in the town, have chickens in their garden. And if you go to the butchers, you will see, they'll have pictures of the animals in a natural setting, all smiling, looking happy, because they're trying to reassure you that, this is just this is the familiar relation that
this is normal.
This is, they are, people who don't mind being reminded of the reality, because the reality for them isn't as horrific in that it was this small-scale domestic cultivation of animals. And that's how they see it. And a lot of the butchers here, I think, still work in that way. So they haven't. But I don't know. I don't know where they're sourcing their things. There may be more industrialized than I expect.
And there's an interesting counterpoint which I find really productive, which is one obvious focus of people who are advocating for animals and veganism and so on is understandably to focus on the negatives and the horror and the experience the animals going through those processes. But I think equally important is to do what we do in intrahuman ethics and imagine what genuine positive, long, flourishing family lives are like for these beings. And you spend some time in a really good quality sanctuary that's rescued animals and is looking after them. The richness of relationships, even cross-species relationships, the joy, the play, that's just I think a much more positive, way into this topic as well, that you can set against the negative. It's not just a negative story. It is, back to your point earlier on, it's about the potential for flourishing and what a flourishing life can really be like. And
I think here's what I might say. Care as much as you can. That in certain societies, it would be very hard to be a vegan. In medieval England, it would have been hard to be a vegan, and I guess, you wouldn't have eaten meat very often, but you would have needed some of it.
Yeah.
And needed milk, I suppose. And
large-scale animal product consumption is a very modern and quite Western thing. Yeah,
absolutely. So it wouldn't have been the cultures where it's not. There's societies and situations where it's not easy to give that amount of care to animals. To, for instance, to have to treat pets with the lavish way we do. And maybe we treat them too. We spoil them too much, actually, and it's not healthy for them. But as our material conditions improve, it's appropriate to extend our concern as far as we can. I think, you couldn't have been a vegan, I guess, in Paleolithic times, but now you can, and there's a reason for being so, namely that you're not causing unnecessary suffering. So, try. Try and see it as. I think I'd probably be more inclined to tell people to try and do better than to insist that there are, in a sort of dogmatic way, that there are. It's a black and white issue.
Yeah, and I think there's something to that, because even the purest so-called vegan is not leading a harm-free life. Even the production of plant crops cause some harm as well. So the idea that there's some sort of perfect moral purity you can achieve, I think, is a dangerous concept.
I agree. Yeah.
At the same time, like you say, we can make real, meaningful progress in the choices we take. So, but it can be tough in the social context. I know from the journey I went through, I thought this way decades before I acted this way, right? So I hope many other people can take the journey a bit quicker, but yeah.
Well, I think it's a collective thing, and I think it's very important that there are people who are stating the case as forcefully as possible, so that it's an important part of it. We make progress collectively, not individually.
Yeah, and it's a systemic thing as well, because I think the vast majority of humans, if we'd grown up in a vegan world where we just used plant-based agriculture and plant-based foods, and there was no such thing as animal agriculture, it would be a very rare person who would say, I know what I'm going to do today. I'm going to go out and kill some animals. Or, a startup would say, we're going to start this new process. You'd think they were crazy, absolutely. Right? So those social defaults and those systemic inertia is the dark heart of the problem.
Make it easy for people to live good lives. We tend to do the opposite, I'm afraid, in some cases.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I really should let you go eventually. The final question we normally ask, and we've been talking about this all the way through, really, is how do we make a better world? And some people like to have a sort of utopian grand vision. Others have a more thematic idea. But do you have a sense about how you're thinking about, the nature of mind plays into whether you do have a vision for a better world, whether it's for all humanity or even for all sentientity? How do you think about the future and our prospects collectively?
Well, right at the moment, I think we should stop making things worse. Everything would be a good start.
Right.
Let's make sure we keep the gains, the progress we've made. I think it's the most important thing. I'm not a utopian, and I distrust revolutionary sentiments, because I think revolutions, you throw everything up in the air, and it's very hard to reconstruct things afterwards, and there tends to be a battle as to who gets to do the restructuring, and it often leads to authoritarian things. I'm much more of a gradualist of let's try and build things. Now the difficulty is when you have systems like, I guess, the agricultural system that we have, that are fundamentally sort of structured in the wrong way. How do we go about changing that? How do we improve things? one of the problems is that we're not dealing with a static system. We're dealing with a system that is continually evolving, and it's evolving rapidly accelerating pace under pressures that we don't even understand properly. It's easy to pick out individuals and say it's this person's fault, it's that person's fault, but very often these people are just riding a wave that they don't even really understand at all themselves.
Yeah. And everyone in the system can point to everybody else, and around
That's
it goes.
not going to do anything. So how do you bring about systemic change in a positive direction? Technology is evolving exponential rate. We don't know what sort of world we'll be living in even 10 years' time. How do we start to organize ourselves to build a better world when we don't know what we're going to be dealing with by the time they organize the plans? We're trying to put the plan into action. It's never been harder to plan for the future. And that's another reason I think for being skeptical of utopian visions, because a vision that might work under current conditions probably might not work under the conditions that will hold in 20 or 30 or 40 years time.
Yeah.
So
you don't have an easy answer for us.
And there's this huge amount of inertia in the systems. I mean, the thing is, okay, you could say, look, the system of agriculture, whatever, food production is bad. You can't just smash it up though, because people won't get nourished. How do you do this? I don't know. I really don't know. But I do know one thing, and this is perhaps the thing that this is where it connects up with my work and everything I try to do, is that the more we know, the more we understand about the natural world and the social world that we've created, and the economic systems that we have, and the systems of production that we have, the more we understand about that, the better we'll be able to live with them and push them, hopefully, in better directions. Knowledge, education is absolutely essential. And this is how it connects with my take on the mind, that there's a certain way of conceiving of the mind that says there are facts about minds that we can never really know. We can only speculate about and do metaphysical frameworks. I think we can do a lot better than that. I think we can understand minds a lot better than some people think. And I think if we do that, that's going to put us in a better position to understand the lives of our fellow creatures, and indeed the lives of each other, and indeed our own lives. So that's how it ties up with that. And the hope I have, this is what I say to my children. I say, I can't tell you what things are going to be like for the rest of your lives, or what you're going to need, what skills you're going to need. But what you are going to be sure you're going to need is the flexibility to learn and adapt to new conditions, because conditions are going to change. So, and I worry that the direction of some current technology in AI is actually impeding this connection, this educational process, and rather as the factory farming is distancing us from the reality of the animal suffering. So AI and other technologies is putting us at a distance from the actual the reality of the world we live in. We're living in this virtual world, and it's impeding our access to the natural and the technological reality behind it. And I don't know how we do this. We just got to have faith in ourselves and in our capacities to understand things and respond sensitively to them.
Yeah, thank you. And I feel in a very similar way, right? The sheer complexity of the world and our epistemic uncertainty and even our ethical uncertainty, to a degree, sort of leads me to retreat back to the topics we've been talking about today, which is like, I don't really know the answers, but if we have a well-grounded epistemology and we have a generous, universal ethical scope, that's got to be, two solid foundations that should be pretty robust that we can use to work through. And that also leads me to emphasize the point about education too. And And there's one thing that gives me real hope there, because I'm lucky to run workshops in schools with kids and teachers about these sort of worldview ideas. And young kids love these big questions, right? 6, 7-year-olds, if you ask them, how do you know what's true? How do you know what's real? Who should we trust? Who matters? They are brilliant little philosophers, way better than the average adult on Twitter, which is a low bar. But, it gives me hope, right? Because people really do want to engage deeply in these foundational questions, and maybe better answers to those will give us a better chance.
I couldn't agree more. My partner, Maria, has done a lot. She's a philosopher too, but she's also a teacher, and she's done a lot of work with children, doing P4C, and this is something she's working. I mean, you might be interested to talk to her. She comes back with it's something she's invested a lot in and thought a lot about. And what you said there is absolutely resonates with me from listening to her talk about her work. Children have a thirst for this, and particularly, I think, pre-adolescent children, before the hormones are kicking this, and then they'll have to be so confusing. They can think with extraordinary clarity
and bravery,
with bravery and clarity, and with a willingness with an openness and they don't yet realize the rules of thinking, of what things are acceptable to think and what things are orthodox and what are not orthodox. They cut straight to the chase, and they see things with a clarity that we lose. We get enmeshed in a social world that obscures things from us, and children see much more clearly in many ways than we do. And so I think, yes, we need to feed that appetite in children and help them form attitudes then of openness, of love, of inquiry, and moral passion too, that can then inform the rest of their lives. And they need to have that, and also an adaptability, a flexibility, an openness of thinking. What Dennett called, what was it? Juicing, ability to jump out of the system. And children can do that. So yes, as always, the children are our hope. And I think the more we can invest in them, the better. And also, I would just add another encouraging thing, is the kind of thing that you're doing. The public engagement, I think, is incredibly important. And you're doing it with a seriousness, not with a kind of heavy-handed. I know you have very strong feelings about this, and I respect them, and I don't, but you don't do it in a heavy-handed way, but you do it with seriousness. These things matter to you, and it's clear that you're addressing an audience who also, I hope, realize that these things matter and are taking that message from you. We need to be serious, which could also doesn't mean we can't be have some fun at the same time, but we can't just let this play out as it will. We need to get actively involved, all of us. Otherwise, other people will see how it plays. We'll force it to play out in certain ways that are not good for us.
That we can see all around us all the time. Unserious people. Yeah,
that's true. And there's a lot of money to be made out of cultivating unseriousness.
Absolutely, money and power.
So much to be made out of cultivating seriousness, unfortunately.
No. Well, we nearly managed to finish on a hopeful note, and then we just
it was a little bit of a roller coaster, wasn't it?
It was.
Kept going one way, and then that's where we are. That's where we are. It's an exciting time.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for investing so much time with me and busting your diary to continue on. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
You too. It's nice to have a proper conversation with you rather than just little brief exchanges on social media.
Online snippets. Yeah. So what's the best way of people following you, buying your books? Obviously, I'll put your website and your various links in the show notes, but where would you mostly direct people to if they want to stay up to date with you?
My website's a good place to find out pretty much everything you would want to find out about me. And there's a blog there that I'm not so active at the moment, but I do occasionally post stuff. So that's a good place. And you can get in touch with me there through the form. If you want, through the contact form. If you can also follow me. I do not post on Twitter anymore, but you can, I'm on Blue Sky, and you're very welcome to interact with me there. I try to reply, always tried to be an active participant on Twitter. It's not always, other things get in the way, but I'm always happy to receive messages and and comments, and I'll try to respond as best I can. So I'm happy to chat there. And I'm always sort of doing interviews and stuff, that saying my little pieces about things.
Yeah, and of course, subscribe to your Mind Chat YouTube and podcast, and your Mind to Mind podcast as well. Yeah.
Yes. I have actually some other podcast plans which will be appearing at some point. But
awesome.
If you want to find out, it'll be easy to find me.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And yeah, I'd love to talk to Maria about her P4C work at some point too. So yeah, feel free to put us in touch. But
she does talk a lot about with the questions about animal ethics in particular. So.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. Well, thank you again so much for being a guest on Sentientism. Please do stay in touch. It's been a genuine pleasure.
For me too. Thank you.